I'm Joanna Holmes and I'm a consultant social worker for West Midlands Social Work Teaching Partnership. I want to welcome you all to this research seminar, which is brought to you by the partnership. I'll just give you a brief introduction to the work of the partnership. We are one of 27 accredited teaching partnerships in the country, and we bring together academics, practitioners, senior leaders and experts to strengthen the quality of social work education, training and practice across the region. We have 27 partners, including HEIs, Children's Trusts, local authorities and NHS trusts. One of the areas we've been working on is improving social workers' access to and understanding of research and supporting them to apply messages from research to their day-to-day practice. One way we hope to do that is by these seminars. And today we're joined by Karen Roscoe from the University of Coventry, who will be presenting her research on critical discourse analysis and professional identity. There will be time for questions at the end, but we'll be monitoring the chat throughout the seminar for questions. So if you have any questions, pop them in the chat and I'll put them to Karen at the end. I'll just remind everyone to ensure that any comments in the chat are respectful and non-discriminatory, and we are recording the session, so be mindful of that and don't give any sensitive information in your comments. Before I hand over to Karen, I just wanted to make you aware that we have some resources on our website from NICE, providing an introduction to the work of NICE, and it's linked to research, so please go and have a look at that. But for now, I'll hand over to Karen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me today to talk about my research, which was born in practice, really. So I'm going to attempt to share and then start the presentation. So my background was in adult social work, a good probably 15 years ago now since I've practiced. But one of the things that I did find out when I can't talk while I'm trying to, let me just home from beginning. Okay. One of the things that I found when I went out into adult practice was that I was surrounded by quite talk that actually, in effect, I thought demotivated those people around them. So as I practiced, I thought, what is it about adult social work that's demotivating? And how do we unpack that a little bit further? So this PhD was born out of practice and then something that I picked up when I went into teaching in higher education. Okay, so from today, we are going to focus on what is discourse, and it links to narrative approaches because it's the idea of the wider narratives that social work practitioners draw on in their accounts for their professional identity. And one of the things I was curious about was how did the policy objectives like strengths-based practice, person-centred, how does that impact upon practice in specific ways? Because often individuals are working with tools that aren't necessarily what is reframed as strengths-based social work. So amongst those competing discourses, if you like, ways of talking, what became apparent to me was there was always more marginalised ways of talking about adult social work. And the way in which we narrate our identity in UK social work is often very different to international perspectives, even though we know the impact of managerialism and neoliberalism is global. And then it's about giving us an opportunity at the end to reflect on what are the competing discourses, ways of talking in social work, adult social work at the moment. How are they framed? The idea of strengths-based practice, is that realistic within the climate that social work, adult social work finds themselves in? So let's start with the beginning. And discourse isn't necessarily an easy, taken for granted idea that we can understand. So it's important that we unpack that first. And discourse here is any written or spoken language, and is often described by Guy as language in use. So it's that everyday talking that we do when we communicate in our everyday lives. And that is very much the focus of discourse analysis, about looking at the everyday way of talking and rendering that everydayness as quite strange and unpacking some of the ways that people talk. There are various analytical and theoretical approaches to the study of language and society. So this approach is very much about saying the wider society, and in our context, social policy, impacts upon our language and our practice in social work in particular ways, and one will shape another. So for any of you that have been in adult social work for a long time, you will have seen the change from the 1980s in the community care and how social work became very much process driven during that time because of the introduction of managerialism. So these wider aspects of society influence on our everyday language, how we make sense out of our identity in practice. And this is what we refer to as one shaping the other, and it's dialectical, one enforces the other. So any language, if you hear me talking about text, what I'm talking about is language that practitioners have offered me during the interviews and group work focus. So all research here in critical discourse analysis is problem orientated. It aims to explain, critique and change social conditions and the interactions of individuals through this analysis of text or language. So any account is considered as a text. So the socialisation into academic students into academic and professional subjects, a growing interest of sociologists for a number of decades. Acquiring a professional identity or persona involves the internalisation of group values and norms that inform an individual's behaviour and self-concept. Before we entered the practice domain of social work, we already had a preconceived idea, notions of caring, wanting to make a difference, changing people's lives. We already had a pre-construct about what the social work identity was. And we end up holding on to that. It might change and adopt, but in the main, what I found through the research is that individuals hold on to those original constructions of social work throughout their academic and practice socialisation. So our professional identity then is a process of time, adoption and change, and this underlies the trajectory from novice to fully qualified practitioner, and any associated or contingent claims to being a professional in social work. So here we can understand identity as being understood as a generic process of being and becoming within interrelationships and interdependencies with others. So our wider social backdrop in adult social work of a very managerialist ideology means that often practitioners can feel in conflict with what they set out to do in social work. But the self has different social identities, and they originate from both our own self-concept and our interaction. So here, identity is a process of being and becoming. It's never fully completed and can change and morph over time and membership with different groups. So we might think of our identity in social work then, particularly because we're surrounded by changing landscapes and social policy initiatives, that our identity might never be somehow complete, but instead it remains a shifting, changing and sometimes contradictory entity, can't get my words out today, bound up in complex relationships and meanings. So we can often have days where we feel that the real motivation and reasons for coming into social work have been fulfilled. But there'll be many days in adult social work, from my understanding and my own occupational socialisation, about that talk about the administrative, bureaucratic aspects of our practice. Just moving my little box so I can see what's on my screen. So there's been much research conducted on professional identity, particularly student nurses, teachers, physicians and academics, but there's been little inquiry into how social work practitioners and students construct their social work identity. So this study included both students and qualified practitioners, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the students' qualitative accounts. But many of you in the seminar today will recognise those accounts as the everyday way of talking about the social work identity in the UK. So at the time of the study, respondents were engaged in routine assessment practice with adults likely to be in need of care or support. Students undertook this work using the Unified Assessment Tool, which is the single assessment in England. Their assessment activity drew on the personalisation agenda. And this does remain still the policy and practice throughout adult social work. And you can see this in UK law, in the Care Act, and the Welsh law equivalent, which is Social Services and Wellbeing Act. So this typically takes the form, you'll see in lots of policy objectives, person-centred models of intervention. We've now replaced that with strengths-based models of intervention, even though we still hold on to concepts of person-centred. Person-centred planning and personalisation of services seems to be the key messages within legislation. So effective assessment of individuals and thresholds for intervention are deemed to be met by the social worker, facilitating the oversight of person-centred care. So today it's been replaced with the language of strengths-based, and we'll have a discussion about that at the end of the presentation. But there's been many criticisms of the type of assessment practices across the UK, particularly the nature and volume of information collected via the Unified Assessment Tool in Wales. So if I remember rightly, at the time, the Unified Assessment and the single assessment in adult social work was to try to avoid duplication by multiple practitioners if they had lots of individuals involved in their social care, rather than duplicating and asking people the same information over and over again. But it ended up being a very cumbersome piece of assessment, which had lots and lots of pages to fill in. So social work became more and more bureaucratic as we develop in policy initiatives. So with that backdrop going on, one of the things I wanted to do was to try and understand, how do students and practitioners then make sense of this assessment task? And this assessment task is the very heart of the social work role and identity. So in this then, I was going to ask students and practitioners what they feel like in adults social work in the here and now. How had they seen that it changed? So we got less about how it changed from our students, but what I captured in my research was how students navigated local authority contexts as they became socialised into practice through their practice placements. So the best way of analysing how they understand their identity was to look at discourses, but not just on one level, to look at discourse on multiple levels, which is what critical discourses analysis is about. And here, discourses argue to create organisational realities and identities. So there have been discourse analytic studies of workers' talk, but these have mostly been carried out in children and family social work. So, for example, in that research, it was found that psychodynamic was privileged over many ideas in social work in children and families. It tended to be favoured. So that tells us about the types of practices that social workers were trying to enact out during their practice at that time. Pithouse and Atkinson also demonstrated how case talk relied heavily on the structure of the social worker's narrative. So if you think about our storytelling, every time we go to supervision, we will tell a story of a case. But when we tell that story of a case, it does involve multiple voices and different scenarios. And what we found in that research was that practitioners would try to persuade the listener that their diagnosis, if you like, or hypothesis about the case was the right one by using key phrases and rhetorical strategies from policy. So you might hear practitioners saying, well, it was person-centred because. And that told us that social workers are very conscious about how they craft their narratives around casework, because supervision tends to be the only way in which we monitor a practitioner's outputs and practice through supervision. So they described how social workers appropriate a range of institutional voices, such as legal, medical and administrative, to support their practice decisions. And this is normal, this is what we would expect, but this enables us to see how case talk, the way we talk about cases and case studies, is a type of discourse that we have become familiar with in our practice. So we will always say to a practitioner, I've got this really complex case, and then we start narrating the case. And this is what Fairclough refers to as a genre, a way of talking and interacting in social work. So we talk about our cases in particular ways. So how was I going to analyse the talk of people, and why would it tell me anything about their identity? Well, critical discourse analysis is interested in the recursive language, the routinized language that's related and repeated during their everyday talking. So I wanted to explore how this recursive nature of talk in adult social work closely connected to the way in which they constructed their personal and professional identities. And we must recognise that we choose a profession based on our own personal motivation. We don't choose a job that we wouldn't like. We choose a job because we try to align it with our own personal values and sense of purpose and what we're trying to achieve in our careers. So we can interlink both the personal identity together because they're intrinsically linked. So to reiterate, we see these types of exchanges between the researcher and the interviewer as types of language or text to be analysed for multiple meanings and levels of interpretation. And this is what we refer to as intertextuality in critical discourse analysis. So when a practitioner comes, so when my students go in to a 70-day placement or an 80-day, whatever it is now, they will be pre-socialized. They will be socialized into pre-existing ways of talking about social work. So what this shows is that any talk has an intertextual dimension, meaning that it's not a narrative or a piece of language that exists in isolation, but it contains aspects of history and the wider socio-cultural aspects of the individual in their environment. So this tells us that everything that people say or do in practice has a wider intertextual dimension, linking in this case to social policy initiatives, to culture, and to some of our personal and professional constructs of identity. So when we're able to see texts in this way, this historicity enables the researcher to understand how discourse, or the types of genres that are available over time within the linguistic territory of adult social work. So I'll give you an example. At the moment, in children and family social work, the discourses surrounding troubled families is about restorative practice, claimed or framed within strengths-based social work. But when you begin to unpick it and you try to look for strengths-based theories, they don't exist within the model and the framework. So we can use rhetorical tropes like strengths-based to claim that certain ideas link within certain categories and ways of talking about social work. So how do we do this? Well, it's very complex, and one of those PhD studies that you think, why did I start this? So when we look at discourse in social work, any language, we'll start with this. I've got a little pen here, actually. I'll try and draw on there. Let's put a pen. So we start here at the textual analysis. I'll put a little cross there. And the textual analysis really is about, I would say to a student, tell me what you think social work is. What did you think it was? And what do you think social work is now? What are the contradictions? What are the complexities? So when I'm analysing the quotes of my respondents, I'm looking for these 7 key dimensions. So the first thing is, what types of words are they drawing on? And how do those words infer a particular ideological or political significance in social work? So they're saying things like, I'm person-centred because. So we know that person-centred has an ideological backdrop because it's come from social policy. The grammar, meaning the verbs, represent what the person sees the social worker doing to or with the service user. And it often tells us something about the assumptions of what they think the social work role is and the identity of the service user. Then we look at cohesion, so the use of pronouns and how this speaks of alignment of the social worker's identity. For example, you'd often hear students saying, this person did this and this was really bad practice. So in critical discourse analysis, we'd say, so what's the opposition of that? So this person is inferring then that they, because they're positioning them as over there, that this person is inferring that they're different to them and that they're possibly presenting bad social work as opposed to good. So we can often tell something about people's positioning of identity by the use of their pronouns. And this is where discourse analysis links to narratives, which is often misunderstood, that within any story or any account, there is an overall text structure. And we will talk about that text structure as an order of discourse later on in the presentation. And then we will look at force of utterance, which is the type of rhetoric or metaphor that people use to persuade the audience or to construct their identity about social work. So we will often hear the terms, I want to make a difference. And what I will say to my students is, but do you think that you always make a difference? There's an assumption that in social work, by saying I want to make a difference, that in every single interaction that you have in social work, you're making that difference. Now, that might be true on some levels, but there's a naivety and it becomes a metaphor that we use, and you hear it in any advertisement about social care professions or nursing. They'll say, do you want to make a difference? Come into the caring profession, nursing, counselling, social work, teaching. So this idea that everybody will always make a difference tells us something about the identity, the construct of what a social worker does, and they're intended to make a difference. So you might then argue, if they don't make a difference, are they considered a bad social worker? And that might be what is being inferred. And the last two are less about looking at the language, but looking at how these first 5 categories link to wider. And this is where we draw on coherence and intertextuality. So after we've done our textual analysis, we will look at how does this link to wider culture? So discursive practice means how discourses consumed by those in the culture, how are they then reproduced in the culture, and how are they distributed by those practitioners. So we would look at what types of genres are being played out here, and how do they then link to wider social practice, meaning the historical and political context of social work and social policy. So we know that social policy does not just arrive in a vacuum. It will have been as a result of findings of research. So terms like person-centred, strengths-based come out of the feedback of those people with lived experience telling us that it doesn't feel like that on the ground floor, and therefore we need to be more person-centred or more strengths-based. So this micro textual analysis, and this is where we begin to link in how does it tell us something about how people are constructing their identity? Well, it captures what's called the relational, experiential and expressive values of the social actor. And expressive values depict the ways in which social actors evaluate the subjects within an account and in doing so reveal aspects of their identity. So they will talk about their self, and by using terms like I, they will use certain pronouns, and they will refer to individuals in some cases as almost like objects. And then we've got our experiential values, depending on what knowledge and beliefs they're drawing on. This will often tell us something about the individual's own worldview, and it represents and almost echoes the social and cultural world that they are a part of. And the relational values in any language or text reveals something about the way organisational interaction or their individual subjectivity and relationships are constructed, and this then determines their practice. On the wrong one there. So let's start looking at some of the themes, and let's start with the quote at the top for you to hold on to while I'm going through these themes. Now, think about your own early constructions of what you thought social work was, and then think about what it was like, or at times during practice, where you feel as if you're going against that constructed identity, or the sense of purpose of what it was that you were trying to do. And what this captures this really in the sense that when conflict involves practical issues of existential importance, it can have, on the contrary, a paralysing effect, rigidifying and further polarising the opposing positions, thereby preventing conceptual creativity and therefore the solution of the conflict. So I don't know about anyone else. I'm just going to hand it over to the floor for a minute. I like to have some interaction. Can anybody identify with what I'm talking about there? This idea that you came into practice with one set of ideas and then you're often finding yourself in conflict with those ideas about what you intended to do in practice. I don't know whether we can open the floor out just to a couple of discussions about that, if anyone's brave enough. Anyone? Nobody got the hand up? Okay. So, some of the themes that Sandra's got a hand up.
To be honest, I'm going to say the opposite of what happened on my course. I was at Coventry Uni, we had John Harris,
Oh, yeah.
and we definitely got a pre-warning about neoliberalism and the impact that could potentially have. And I think it helped me with my expectations, to be honest.
Good. And I mean, that's a really important point. If we're not given the political context of social work, then we can almost be setting people up to fail when they actually experience it, can't
Absolutely.
we? So I think the discourse, although it can seem quite negative, the neoliberalism and the managerialism, nonetheless, it's a beast almost that we've got to live with and live alongside, haven't we?
Yeah.
We can't eradicate that. But I think you make an important point. And yes, John does teach social policy, but there are lots of social work programs out there without social policy as a subject. And that worries me about this idealism of social work that we might present before people go out into practice, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So some of the themes that we identified, first and foremost, we're going to go through these 4 or 5 themes to give you an illustration of the overall picture of how adult social work was described by social workers social work students following their 70 and 100-day placements, 80 or 100, it's 70 and 100, isn't it? So the first one we're going to look at is force of utterance. So often they would describe practice as just like a revolving door. And grammar and verbs affecting change. So they talked about difficulties with affecting change into practice. The semiotic choices, meaning the choice of vocabulary, referred to social work very much as a one-to-one practical activity, which told us something about individualistic social work. And then when they talked about one-to-one social work, they often referred to it as a very therapeutic individual ideal, which they sort of wanted to be more like a counsellor. And the order of the discourse was, how did they model this particular identity against this set of administration and managerialism? And I framed that in the paper as bureau professional model. So the force of utterance, let's talk about that first, just like a revolving door. So some of the themes there, I'm just going to move my little box. A student says, but I felt like, what's going on? I thought practice is supposed to be person-centred. So here the respondent is drawing on what we refer to in critical discourse analysis as a rhetorical trope, which is to emphasise the disjunction between the expected and the actual, like what is going on. And this signals and draws attention to the investment that the student made in the ideas of person-centred and her contrasting experience of a much more administrative approach. And these types of discourses resulted in producing organisational subjectivities, meaning their sense of identity, to a performative sense of self and identity vis-a-vis appropriate work. In essence, what they implied throughout this was that the good social worker was the one that did person-centred. And so anything else was contrasted against this rhetorical trope, which is often in social policies, trying to encourage us to practice in particular ways. So within much of the formal codes about social work surrounding assessment, tropes are embedded in policies such as person-centred practice, and these stand in contrast to some of the ways in which policy is implemented via mechanistic, procedurally driven screen-based technologies. And tropes are figures of speech, and rhetorical tropes are used to produce a shift in the meaning of words. These are often used in conversation to persuade the listener to consider this as the perspective. So the students are almost trying to convince me, going, but you've been teaching this, and this is what it feels like when we're out there in practice. They're not overtly saying that, but that's almost what it feels like when you're receiving it after students come back from placement. So number of students within the cohort of my interviews said it was just like a revolving door, and this reflected the fast pace of social work practice in adult services. This metaphor was to describe the pace as problematic, and noted how students shared a sense of being unable to challenge this prevailing experience of practice. So this revealed something about the way that the discursive world, meaning the cultural world of the social worker, where the student almost becomes powerless and becomes normalised through metaphors across the student community. One student described, I just kept my head down rather than seek some remedy to what was perceived as unsatisfying relationship-based practice. Likewise, another final year student noted the unappetising choice of having to put up or shut up, basically. So I would follow through with the question going, well, is it always like that? You know, are there any contradictions to that? And the students are not able to see those contradictions or to see some of the smaller, less heard stories about adult social work, because this becomes the cultural way in which we describe practice in some cultures, not all. And this then linked to this idea that people felt, and some of the practitioners felt, that change was actually impossible in practice. So some of the quotes there saying really negative, as in, what's the point? There's no point because you can't change anything. Let it go, you're not going to change anything. So this is where we looked at the language of the functional grammar, and whereby material verbs are understood to represent action and interaction and uncover who does what to whom. So in this analysis, the accounts were notable around change and were used to describe a sense of inefficiency in relation to practices they deemed unsatisfactory. So in critical discourse analysis, we would say that, okay, if you're talking like that, does that mean you think like that? And does that mean that you practice like that? So critical discourse analysis will say that our language and our thought processes are intrinsically linked. They're culturally and socially bound. And so this will then infiltrate the individual into their practice. So as an educator in social work, you can see why when students come back from practice and they're talking like this, as an educator then, I would have to then do something to unpack this to try to change the construction, and something which we'll get on later on. So overall, the picture presented by students in adult social work was that they were powerless, and that these students have that this discourse has an intertextual historical context, because it links to the institutionalization and normalization of managerialism in occupational cultures over time. And we can often feel powerless in all of our jobs. But for me, for the developing student, if they begin to take on discourses and ways of talking like this before they're even in practice, then it paints a bleak picture of social work in adult services. So critical discourse analysis can assist in revealing the ways in which institutional and political positionings of social work as a technical administrative practice become culturally and discursively grasped by those individuals into the occupation. This sense of disjunction between idealised notions of practice can be detected in the text, but does not infer that students are simply or passively discovering the cultural or individual power some prior institutional. So what we're saying is, it doesn't infer that there is a total and overall view of how social work should be viewed, but it does acknowledge the power of culture in infiltrating that view of social work. But what we say is there's often space for human agency. We can reconstruct the way we promote or understand our occupational identity, and we need strategies so that we can do that. So as I note next, students clung tenaciously to what they shared as the preferred view of social work and what social work ought to look like. So listen to the language here, and it says something about our UK style of social work, and we refer to this as a type of genre. I wanted to work with people and be on a one-to-one basis and make things happen for people. So look at the pronouns in there, for. It's not make things happen with people, it's for people. And the identity there is implicitly showing that the social worker is the person coming in and making things happen for people rather than the individual making things happen for themselves. Being with them and working with them on a one-to-one basis, doing one-to-one work with them and being by their side, helping them on a one-to-one basis. So I would say, well, what did you originally think social work was when they gave these contrasting narratives or discourses? And you can hear then that you can almost see here that this is almost like the pre-construction before people are socialised, perhaps educationally, about what it is that social workers do in terms of assessment of needs and care planning. Here, there's more of a support work type mentality, being by them one-to-one by their side. Now, that's more like, if I read those quotes and I wasn't a social worker, I might think, oh, so that's like a support work role. So then anything in contrast to that then becomes a problem. So in contrast, this is what they were saying. Well, you just feel like an administrator and everything you feel is like your responsibility. Well, after being there a while, I felt as if frustration took over because most of it is just basically typing away on a computer, getting all the boxes ticked and doing the assessments and going to panel. So these words in the text represent the underlying ideologies that signify certain kinds of identities and relationships in social work. So this one-to-one is perhaps the ideal of social work. So you might call that the thesis, how people have constructed a thesis about social work. And then you get this, well, everything's administration. And that's almost like the discourse of antithesis, two opposites. So you can see how students are grappling with, but I had this construction about social work, and actually now I've got this construction. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. So critical discourse analysis will look at the dialectical relationship between where do they get these ideas of one-to-one social work. This is the pre-socialisation. How does that influence their personal then and professional sense of identity? And here we understand identity to be an effect of discourse, ways of talking, as well as constructed in discourse. So we know in the 1980s, during the Barclay report, that social work was replaced with the word social care. So you can see how our identity becomes constructed in discourse throughout the decades, depending on what is flavoured at any given time. Favoured, not flavoured. And this then becomes a way in which we enact or try to avoid specific roles. So if we say everybody should be person-centred, then anything that goes outside of that then could be constructed as not person-centred, implying that it's not good social work. So we have to think about the way that people make sense in their cognitive processes. Okay, I'm just moving my little box. So this one-to-one social work then did reveal very much when I started to say to them, what does one-to-one social work involve? What I heard was genres of counselling. So, okay, we have a therapeutic side of social work in the way that we conduct our assessments and work with individuals. We should have therapeutic elements to developing rapport with individuals. But we were never trained to be counsellors. So it's interesting that pre-socialisation, one-to-one social work, when I asked them, what does that mean? They would refer to things like therapy, cognitive behavioural therapy, all of these ideas that they drew on, which they considered as person-centred. But we know that individualistic social work is a genre in the UK. For example, we removed group work off the PCF and the standards in social work. So we're almost pushing people into more individualistic work because we don't necessarily want group work as being a skill that social workers need anymore. And this becomes a social practice then in human services. So the rise of individualism has been theorised by sociologists such as Giddens and Beck in the context of reflexivity. What this means is that we consider this on an everyday basis. It's something that we're supposed to do. So the idea is that selfhood under consumer neoliberalism is viewed as increasingly asocial and bound up with quests for self-enhancement. And we can go back further. We can see the historical construct of self-enhancement. It started off in the early days as self-help, and that was from the Christian days of free will. Then it went to self-help, then it went to self-determination, and now it's about strengths-based self-enhancement. So you can see that throughout the decades, neoliberalism is less about working on a collective level to challenge inequality, but it's working at this micro level on a one-to-one basis with individuals. And we haven't shifted much from changing the individual in their social environment, which was very much what Mary Richmond said in the very early days of the development of social work. And interesting, Mary Richmond used the terms maximising independence in the Victorian era, and yet we still see that language throughout the Care Act, and we see it throughout the Social Services and Wellbeing Act in Wales. So this is our ideology. This is the UK ideology. If you go to Brazilian social work, they start with teaching around Marxism and the violence of capitalism, whereas we start with human growth and development and the very micro aspects of practice. We may touch on some more radical approaches in social work theory and education, but in the 70s, radical social work was removed off the curriculum and replaced with law. So even our curriculum is infiltrating a very individualistic approach to social work in the UK. So students use terms like counselling to change their cognitive processes, and these terms signify those diagnostic approaches to practice originating from the early inception of social work by Mary Richmond and its many manifestations later. So we're still in this diagnostic role. We're still thinking, even though the narrative is the wider genres are about strengths-based and we're supposed to be working with people in our communities, and for example, person-centred planning came out for people with learning disabilities in the 1990s, and in the years, maybe in 2010 and 2015, I'm still going out and trying to look for person-centred plans for people with learning disabilities. What becomes something in policy doesn't always manifest itself at the cultural level because we are in this mindset of individualistic social work, helping the person to adjust themselves in their social environment rather than adjusting the social environment so that we reduce and eradicate inequality and the impact of capitalism. So let's pause for a minute because it's all very heavy and complex. So that any words that students and practitioners draw on alongside their verb choices can be viewed as affecting behaviour and interaction within a social system. And just in that example about looking at individualistic social work, you can see that there is a historicity and a societal pressure that comes from that. These ideas aren't just born. So we can go back to Victorian era and look at where self-help, self-determination, free will still manifests itself today in the way that we work. So it ends up meaning that we result in the enactment of these certain social relations. So by analysing linguistic choices such as support and enable, this illustrates how the becoming subject, the student or the practitioner, is always surrounded by pre-existing discourses of what casework is or should be, and that there is a wider intertextual dimension for their understanding of what it is to help. So rarely do we hear students say, I'm coming into social work to challenge inequality, to challenge poverty, and to be a political activist. You don't hear students say that for an interview. You hear students saying, I want to make a difference and I just want to help people. But you can even unpack, what do we mean by help? What types of help is that? And that will tell us something about how they've constructed the identity. So in essence, then, the becoming subject is always interpolated by prior cultural practices and ways of talking. And this then becomes the everyday and the taken for granted. And there's a reliance on this language to give a particular picture of reality. And this reality has the potential, though, to limit any student or practitioner's recognition of their own participation in reproducing ideological of what constitutes social work. And that's not placing the blame on anyone. That's to say that we can construct our social world in different ways where we may consider what we're doing is much more radical than we consider it as drawing on Bowlby's theory of attachment, for example. So critical discourse analysis has the potential to offer social work a form of critical self-consciousness from which we seek to challenge and test the individualistic orthodoxies that continue to determine much of the direction of UK social work. And as a result, what I've always do, even when I pick up social work theory and methods modules, what you'll see is there's lots of psychosocial, and it stops. It doesn't give you feminism. It doesn't give you Pablo Freire, radical education. It doesn't talk about, might touch on Marxism, but those arguments in social work have become less powerful because of this individualistic discourse around helping the person at a micro level. So we need to work with our students and practitioners about developing alternative paradigms to practice so that we can instigate some form of radical change. As with the structuring conventions of language, there are always possibilities for alternative constructions. And this is a really important thing that we forget to ask, is when we ask a student whether there is an example of social work where it was more altruistic, or you felt you made a difference, or you felt that you drew on your values of care or wanting to make a difference, the student will always give you that narrative. So you must ask then, why do the more marginalised narratives not get heard? Because the taken for granted everyday language about social work takes over, and what it becomes second nature. Oh, it's all about lack of resources, too much paperwork, all of that. But that becomes a way of talking which restricts our ability to see the more marginalised and good aspects of practice probably align into our original construction of what social work was. So the order of discourse then becomes very much, this is what we mean by order of discourse, is it's the dominant discourse. I'm just trying to move this little square now on the screen because I can't see it. It's not moving. So, for example, this is the main thing when I would say, how are you experiencing social work right now? This is what they would say. It's very bureaucratic culture. It was rules, regulations, decisions made for you. You had the team meetings and they were a complete waste of time. Then you had form filling to do. And the next bit of the quote because I can't move my little box. Just bear with me. Moved it now. Filling and computer work that you had to do. Very power driven, I suppose. If you don't sort of conform to what you know, what the policies and the procedures say, then I suppose you have a problem. Well, after being there, I felt as if frustration took over, mostly typing away on the panel. It's a top-down bureaucratic perspective, really. I found it was controlled, managerially controlled, and it was in that framework. Now, interestingly, for the last couple of years, I've been teaching apprentice students who have a contrast placement in their final year. And what I hadn't picked up on, which was really interesting, because I've always taught undergraduates or MAs, was even the students coming from children and families who went into adult services, when they, even on their contrast placement, they were coming back saying it's very procedural, it's very managerially performance managed, everything's ticked off. And the children and family social workers, students, weren't talking like that. So the contrast, it seems to be a discourse particularly attributed to adult social work, more so than children's. And I'm not saying that children's is less bureaucratic, because it will be, but it appears that adults seems to be much more performance management driven and micromanagement of the individual, and that was the experience of some of the students going on a contrast placement, not in a negative way, but just that it was very different to what they'd experienced. So, like I say, if you ask a student, though, if there are any discourses that coexist alongside that order of discourse. So that order of discourse is not unfamiliar to us. We've all heard quotes like that. We've all heard practitioners talk like that. It's paperwork, it's bureaucracy, it's unnecessary, it slows you down, you can't do face-to-face work, it's a tick box exercise. All those ways of talking about social work are predetermined, familiar, and occupation are widely circulated within our occupational culture. But discourses of adult social work are not necessarily fixed or immutably given. They're always subject to negotiation through competing meanings. So while practitioners and students can be consumed and constrained by discourses of tick boxing, there were spaces to assert a more relational-based approach in line with the preferred practice ideals. So there were other quotes where students would say things like, when I had an assessment to do and I had a bit more time to do that and I did support visits, then I'd come back on a high. It would bring me back up on a high. So addiction to the order of discourse, that it isn't always bureaucratic, it isn't always form filling. There is opportunities for you to show your skill in your support visits, in your assessments, but the order of discourse takes over to the point where individuals, including myself and other practitioners, you can do this with any order of discourse, that we fail to see the more marginalised discourses because the dominant discourse takes over. So while students' accounts are typically dominated by frustration, we can see that the preceding quote, that the dominant discourse was not totalising for this student nor for others. So while practitioners might enter an already interpreted linguistic occupational world, they'll soon discover that the world is fallible and open to interpretation and adjustment, and there are often other ways to view events. So as an educator, I had to think, what do we do about this? If I was to leave social workers thinking and students thinking in either or ways, then what that creates is a real existential conflict between what they thought social work was and what they're experiencing social work was. So how do I close that huge gap between two opposites, and how do I try to get people to understand that they both coexist? They're not seen as separate entities. They are seen as two sides of the same coin. We do one-to-one social work, but we equally have a bureau administrative role in documenting that social work. So such an either or perspective in the form of one-to-one practice versus bureau administration is invariably a matter of both coexisting and both struggling to be accommodated. Thus, rather than view these ideas in opposition, through critical discourse analysis, we try to draw on a more dialectical approach to social work, to conceive social work as comprising of contradictions and paradoxes always, and that the student and practitioner needs to come to terms with. They must juggle, if not fully resolve, endorsement to the socially constructed ethics and values of the profession, whilst being located in a managerialist and neoliberalist welfare state. So how do we do this? How do we encourage people to think about their identity construction in different ways? So I came up with dialectical thought processes as a form of logic where everything in any truth in social work can be seen as in opposition to false. So it's almost looking for the opposite argument to be able to see what the antithesis is. So the idea is that Hegel said that there is a dialectical reasoning model that we can use when we try to think about any truth or any reality. And he says that any truth or reality will always have two opposing components. So if you think about the way that we structure our language in the UK, we very much structure things on the basis of either or, tall, short, salt, pepper, fat, thin. Yeah, so we've got these oppositions in our language which encourage us to think in either or ways. What we're trying to do with Hegel's dialectic reasoning is to say that we will always struggle with internal conflicts between what we think are our values and our ideals against what we're actually doing and some of our values and some of our knowledge. And the concern of Hegel's philosophy was our own human agency, specifically the unique ability of our own human consciousness to be aware of itself, to reflect on its future. So what's Hegel's dialectic reasoning model is a form of logic where in my reflective model that I'll present on the next page is about thinking about when students come back to me, or if you're a supervisor or a practice educator, or if you're working with groups of students or hearing this from practitioners, this order of discourse, how do we change the way that they think in a way that's more empowering for them, which enables us to identify the more marginalised ways of talking about social work, and how do we operationalise much more international ideas about social work to say this is UK ideology, this is not your total identity, we belong to something greater and much more collective. So Hegel's dialectic method says we will always, in any truth, we will develop we will always develop a proposition or construction of what something is. And in that, in any thought processes, there's always an antithesis. So it's like anybody, when you're having a bad day and you're not enjoying yourself, you're doing the whole, it's too much paperwork, this is not what I set out to do. You know, this is not what social work is. That's the antithesis of what your thesis is of social work. What we're trying to do in this form of logic is to reach a new synthesis. So we would operate a particular pedagogical tool where we say, okay, let's think about some of the contradictions then that coexist alongside the order of discourse in adult social work. And that's when I would begin to say, so can you give me an example of when you have shown your values, knowledge and ideals of social work? So, and then you almost, there's a penny dropping moment where the student goes, oh yes, so why am I not able to recognise those moments? Because the order of discourse has become so powerful that it's become taken for granted, and it's become an everyday thought processes. So what we're doing is rendering the everyday as strange. And we're saying we're deconstructing and unpacking this truth in a way that says this truth doesn't uphold itself all of the time. There are coexisting counter narratives and discourses that coexist. So in my latest paper then, which took 10 years after a PhD to actually summarise it in 8,000 words after many attempts, I proposed a method which I tested out during my PhD when I was hearing lots of practitioners coming back one of the things that I'd done as a student, as I'd become quite obsessed with the concept of discourse. So when I went out into practice and I heard people talking about this, what I realised was actually I was going out and doing things like narratives, and I was doing, you know, all the sort of values and ideals and the things that I wanted to do in practice. And so I kind of said, well, so why am I different then? And why am I not ascribing to this order of discourse? Because I could see it for what it was. It was representative of a system which isn't aiming to empower its workers. It's aiming to regulate and to, you know, to almost get us to conform into one particular set or style of social work, which is individualistic. So I came up with a model which I tested in my thesis and used, and actually it was, I remember a practice educator coming in, practice educators were in one room and the students were in another. They came back into my room and it was all very positive, empowering, and the practice educator said, that's completely different to how they talked an hour ago. And it was about unpacking this idea of this order of discourse in a way that enabled them to see the good or the things that they originally constructed social work to be. Because it's like anything, if you don't look for counter narratives and you believe a thesis and you're not prepared to move on from that, then ultimately we're going to get stuck in very rigid ways of thinking. So this method for critical analysis and reflection is based on critical discourse analysis and professional identity. It's based on that dialectical thought process about saying, okay, when we come together, how do we view particular things? So the first stage is the thesis. And any practice educator, like I say, with a student who's experiencing difficulties in practice with the administration, and they're starting to question whether that's really what they want to do, we can begin this mapping process to try to get them to understand that there are coexisting discourses. So the first point would be, let's look at their original thesis, their original construction of what social work was. So often I will start by saying, choose 3 or 4 keywords that you think describe what you think social work is, and I'd write all of those on the board. Okay, and what you'll see then is keywords repeating themselves, and it will reflect a particular style of social work. Rarely will you hear political demonstration challenging the status quo. You're going to hear things like, I want to help people, I want to make a difference. For any of you that have interviewed students, if I had £1 for every time they said, I want to help people, I'd be exceptionally rich. So it's about, and what does that help mean? So then you would say, what type of help? What might that help look like? And you get this construction of what they see as social work. And this is where we look at the recurring language, the choice of words that the people are using, and how does that represent a certain set of ideas, certain set of identities, the values, the concepts, and maybe the idealism. And this will convey a particular type of relationship, and often it conveys a very individualistic micro approach. And this then shows us that there's a very one-sided view of social work, and that's understandable given our cultural socialization, because we're not in Brazil and we're not, in India, where we've got different definitions and collective approaches in social work. And this then will infer something about the identities and the roles within that category pair. So after we've done that, so you'd literally do that. You could do that as a one-to-one activity. You could do it as a reflective group discussion, and you could begin to see what category pairs do these words represent? How are they representing a particular style in social work? So then after you've done that, what you would do then is say, so what's the opposite? What are you experiencing? So this is where we ask for the antithesis. Let's ask for the worst of the worst. What does it feel like? And students will, and practitioners, all of us will talk about those tensions, the ethical dilemmas, the expectations, the managerialism, and the things that we set out and we thought social work was against what we're actually experiencing in managerialism. And then it's about saying, so what are the effects of the ideological context of state social work? So getting people to understand the ideological connotations aligned with state social work and how this might impinge social work in a particular way. And then we might say, how do these orders of discourse or ways of talking about social work and our identity impact then on the cognitive, practical aspects of our interaction? So if you come in with a mindset that social work is all about counselling, I can guarantee you then that the way in which people are practicing is more aligned to counselling and therapeutic, because that's what they're wanting to do. I'm not saying in all cases, but people tend to hold on to this original construction. So I'd be asking questions about those individualistic approaches to social work, and then I'd be starting to say, what's missing off the board? What is not said in critical discourse analysis is equally as important as what is said. So we might look for the words that are missing, things like justice, inequality, disadvantage, challenge, advocating, because everybody's stuck in a construction of help. So then we begin to say there are wider constructions of social work. So what we're saying is, let's look at the ideological, historical origins of where these styles of social come from, and how does that influence our interaction in occupational cultures, and then thinking about the idea of practice. So if you think about students who said, what's the point, there's no point, you can't change anything, are they going to carry that attitude with them into a piece of casework? And if they are they going to be apathetic in every single case that they come across, because they're in this thesis and antithesis construction that social work isn't what it said on the tin, and I haven't moved on from that? So the idea is we want to move people from the either or, the two opposing components. We want them to get them to think about a new synthesis of social work by identifying in the third stage then the contradictions and the gaps of what is not said. So you would look at the board, for example, or a piece of paper and go, why isn't social justice in there? What is it about advocacy? What else? And then you begin to scaffold alternative interpretations and wider constructions of social work. We don't do enough on international social work in UK. In some courses they do, they're really good at it, given an international perspective, and then in some courses there isn't. And I think if we don't give an international perspective, we're not able to show the impact of our ideological context to students and practitioners about saying, look, there is a wider agenda about social work. It isn't just about the ideology in this country. So this then provides a type of scaffold for an alternative interpretation and a wider construction of social work. And that includes asking students to look for the good, I shouldn't frame them as good, or the coexisting discourses that exist alongside the aspects of practice that they enjoyed alongside that dominant order of discourse. And this enables them to develop a understanding, or more dialectical understanding, of way of looking at social work by saying, here's the thesis, here's the antithesis. But actually, when you resynthesize that, there are always contradictions. There are always positive aspects to practice. You've just got to look for them, and you've got to ask for them. And we refer to this as fostering new insights which encompass all points of view, meaning the marginalised and the mainstream. And we identify this process of self-realising self-consciousness. Okay, so I think that is it. Just check my last slide. Yeah, there's my very boring references. And I'm going to stop sharing now. So there you go.
That's
Back
great.
to you, Jo.
That's great. Thank you, Karen. Really interesting presentation. We haven't got any questions in the chat, so I don't know if anyone's got any questions they want to put to Karen.